You're on.
Yeah. All right.
You have anything more to say about yourself? Please do.
Oh, no, that's quite a bit actually. Maybe too much even. And I just realized I think I may have forgotten the magic trick that I was going to do, but I'll think of something later. I've got some cards over here by me. I guess one of the other things that I've done lately is something called Kitten Stuff Done, which is sort of like a project management tool, but I'll talk about that later because I actually built all of the cards in Pixelmator Pro. And so that just shows you kind of the usefulness and the power of this. Pixelmator Pro, I remember when Pixelmator was launched originally, the previous version, which they still support both. The company that makes these has both of these tools available, but you'll see that Pro, which I think is about $50 or so, is probably worth the upgrade. Pixelmator just by itself does a lot of the same things, and it's sort of a nice casual tool to get started with. But Pixelmator Pro, it's not like the difference between iPhoto and Photoshop, for instance, right? It's slightly less difference. But I'll also show you that there's some things that you can do in the Photos app, in Apple's Photos app, through Pixelmator Pro that you can't actually do if you just have the non-Pro version. So saying Pixelmator a lot is going to be difficult. So if I say PMP, that's what I mean is Pixelmator Pro. I was a radio journalist for a couple of years at NPR here in Knoxville, and so while my skills are pretty good, saying Pixelmator too many times in a row is going to be difficult. So we'll.
Can you raise your volume a little bit?
Yeah, sure. You want me to talk a little bit louder?
No, we're okay. Is that okay, everybody?
That's good.
Okay. All right. So let me just start by saying that Pixelmator yesterday had a big update. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of this, but it actually changed a little bit of what I wanted to talk about because I used to mention, in fact, the first review I did for Tidbits of Pixelmator Pro, I mentioned that, you know, there weren't as many tools. Obviously, there's not as many tools as with Photoshop, but it's now got Catalina support and it's got CMYK proofing, which was, for me, that was a big problem or a big missing element because I do go to print, and Photoshop, of course, has had print proof tools for years and years and years, and it's got kind of industry standard tools for that, right? So they just added a soft proof colors feature, and so you can see what it looks like when it goes to CMYK. They've also added some machine language support. Now this stuff is baked into Mac OS, but some of this stuff is in Catalina. So one of the things they've got is a Denoise, which removes, you know, noise and artifacts from a photograph. It does a really great job. Related to that is super resolution. And that, again, uses machine learning to increase the resolution of images, which we've probably all had that problem where we try to zoom in or scale something up and we see all the pixels on there. And this actually, it's sort of wild how well it works. I mean, in Photoshop, we used to be able to do things where you could kind of blur it and de-blur and try to sharpen it. There was, all the people had these different formulas. There were some third-party plugins that would let you do this kind of thing. But this machine language super resolution is kind of baked into the OS. And because Pixelmator is Mac native and it's Mac only, it runs a lot faster than Photoshop. So you can do a lot of these things in Photoshop, but the problem is it's going to be a little bit slower. It's going to take you longer and probably more steps. So just to give you an idea, earlier I booted up Photoshop 2020, and it took almost 45 seconds to get to stable state, which is, you know, about a third of the time you would need a steep tea, which is great if you're waiting for your tea to cool off or whatever, but it's not so great if you want to get up to speed. And with Pixelmator Pro, 5 seconds, and it starts right up. And this is on a 2017 iMac. So it's, I mean, it's fairly spec'd out, but that just shows you the disparity in the code, right? So this is working with all of Apple's technologies, Metal, all of the photo editing tools. And as you guys probably know, Apple has for years baked in all kinds of image manipulation tools within the OS. And so that's what Pixelmator is building off of. And that's part of the reason why it's so fast and so efficient, especially if you have one of the, probably from 2015 on up Macs, you're going to see a huge difference. And if you're running the latest operating system, you're going to see a real big difference in performance from Photoshop to this. So just to start off, that's the big thing for me, is that it's faster. It's made for the Macintosh. That's why I tend to use this more often. It has become a lot closer to the feature set in Photoshop. There's still some things missing. So there's no 3D mode for those of you who use that. I don't think I've used that. Well, I've used it maybe twice. It's really slow. It's just laborious to try to deal with and whatnot. I used to teach 3D design, and 3D mode in Photoshop is just as pleasant as any bolted on feature you might imagine. It's really inefficient. So there's none of that in Pixelmator Pro to burden it. There's also fewer proofing tools overall. They did add the Cmyk one, but there's still some other things that are a little lacking there. It's not Adobe, right? So it's made by a different company. So if you are in an Adobe workflow, meaning you go round tripping things from Illustrator or Premiere or After Effects, you're not going to have that continuity. So that's a feature for some people who are doing high-end, type things. But if you're not in as part of a workflow with other people and that kind of thing, it's probably fine. And I think for 90% of people, Pixelmator Pro does everything they need them to do. And then the other thing, though, that I think is still a big problem is that the text tool is not as robust as in Photoshop. And I'll go ahead and just show you this right here, because it's one of the biggest things that people want to do, whether it's on iPad or your iPhone, right? You want to take, memes aren't just for kids, basically. So if you want to take a photograph and you want to put some text on it, that's easy enough, right? You bring in a photo and then you can, you've got a basic text tool here. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see. So we've got the usual stuff, font, the style that you want it in, which is going to change depending on what font you use and all that. But if I go in here, I can click and drag just like in Photoshop and set, here's my text area, and I can write some text. But what I can't do that you can do in Photoshop is deform that text using a variety of sliders and defaults, right? So if you want to create that sort of like Indiana Jones or a bulged text or that kind of thing, or warped text, you've got to go through a lot more steps where you're going to have to convert it to pixels and transform that shape and all of this sort of thing. So that's not nearly as robust in Pixelmator Pro. Also, one of the things I like in Photoshop is that normally you would have a little slider right here where you could easily scale that text up and down. And that's really handy if you're trying to do precise page layout type things, right? You're trying to match the text maybe with some lower text. You can type in here. So if I want to get 66 pixels, I can do that. But it's also got these presets. And, again, this is pretty standard stuff, but I wish it was a little bit more streamlined. The last thing that I'll show you is that you've got a color picker over here that pops up. And this is also kind of a weird anomaly in Pixelmator Pro. One of the things that people have complained about in the past with certain Mac apps is that they, particularly Adobe apps, is they were palette crazy, right? So you've got all these floating palettes running around and you've got to figure out where everything is. What's weird is that Pixelmator is normally a very streamlined interface. In fact, I had to go in, when you first launch Pixelmator, you don't even have labels for your layers. There's a lot of stuff that just is hidden. So I go in and I set, okay, well, show me the names of layers. I can't just go from eyeballing it, and some other things. But everything really just fits in this one window, except for the color palette, which seems to float around like this, and you can't really dock it or anything like that. So that's a pet peeve. Your mileage may vary. Some people don't mind it, but it just seems odd that it's sort of like stuck in there and it's this weird kind of floaty thing. At any rate, that's just to talk about some of the deficiencies in Pixelmator Pro. And I want you to understand that it's probably not the kind of thing that's going to be a deal breaker for anybody. Because again, if you want to do web work, if you want to do photo retouching, even if you want to do a little bit of paint type style work, like illustrative work, it's actually pretty useful. It is not a vector-based program, so it's not a replacement for Illustrator. We're strictly going to be looking at just working with pixels. And in particular, I think that you guys might be most interested in some of the photo retouching and the round tripping aspect of this. So I mentioned, are there any questions so far, by the way?
Mitch?
Yes, is there I'm assuming there's a huge difference between this version and the one used on an iPad.
Yeah, there's you don't have access to a lot of the machine learning stuff in particular. So the iPad version, I believe, is just Pixelmator right now. So it's like the stripped down version. That's right.
Yeah, thanks.
But what's that?
I said that's too bad. That's the way it is. That's the way it seems on a lot of apps.
Yeah. Well, someday there'll be that convergence, right? But not just yet. I think some of the other things too, and I've not used the iPad version in a while, but I think also some of the things that are in there is you don't have as much non-destructive editing. So I want to talk about that real quick because it kind of blew my mind at first when I started thinking about it. Because, you know, most of us are used to undoing, right? Command Z all day long. In Photoshop, you can do, if you want, hundreds of Command Z. If that fails you, let's say you've saved a document, you went away on vacation, you came back, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't mean to save those changes, and now it's baked in there. You could always go back, potentially, if you'd worked on it multiple days in Time Machine, right, and go back and pull a previous version. So think of non-destructive editing as similar to that. In fact, iOS has non-destructive editing as well. If you've ever made an edit to a photo in the Photos app that's built into iOS, you can always go back, you can revert that to its original, right? So it saves basically the original version and it just applies those effects. You can do that in Google Snapseed app as well. You can say, save this image with changes that can be undone. So there's deep support for that in Mac and iOS. But it's important to understand too that there are a couple of things yet, and this is just because the company that makes Pixelmator is, it's a smaller company. And so there are one or two tools, and I don't have time to necessarily like drill down into those today, but if you go to the pixelmator.com website, they've got a thing on non-destructive, and especially if you look in the forums, you'll see that there are a couple of tools they haven't quite made non-destructive yet. So that's a bit of a bummer, frankly, but you can always undo, and there are a lot of things that you'll see that like it doesn't really matter because you do things a little bit differently than you do in Photoshop. So the color changes is probably the biggest thing that you're going to be doing right with photos. If you take a photograph and the white balance is off and all that kind of thing. So first I want to start off with the round tripping. So we're going to bring something in from photos and we're going to start manipulating that. The easiest thing to do, I'm actually in Pixelmator right now. You can see I've got photos open back here. But if I'm in Pixelmator, I can actually go to File, zoom in here, and you see hit this New from Photos. And if I click on that, it'll actually bring up a dialog and it scans through the photos database. It takes it a minute. This is like maybe the slowest aspect of the software, but that's because I've got thousands of photographs in my photo database. So it takes it a second because it's actually rebuilding this index every time. But I can actually pull in a photograph here. Let's bring in Kermit drinking some tea. And there you can see that I've actually, you know, this is actually brought in. It's given an untitled name. So it has created a completely new file based on a photograph that I had in my photos database. If I go to save this, I can save it in iCloud. Pixelmator has its own folder in there. I can save it to my desktop, wherever. And that's the easiest thing if you're already in Pixelmator. I want to show you how in the Photos app, we can do this. It's a little bit different. So we double click like we were going to edit. And if you haven't used the Photos app, it's a great app that, you know, Apple just makes freely available, built into the OS basically. And it's got a lot of really powerful tools. In fact, like I said, a lot of the color manipulation tools that you find in Pixelmator are actually pulling from the same libraries in Mac OS as the Photos app. So if you go over here and you click on Edit, it brings you into editing mode. And that's where you see all of these great little tools over here, which frankly, most of these things, if you click on auto, it will adjust your photograph, and it does a really nice job of that just by default. But we're still in the Photos app, right? By the way, you can see here, it says revert to original. So you can always come back. That's that non-destructive editing that's built in to Mac OS. But I can do another thing here, and this is something that as you buy different apps, as you install different apps on your Mac, you can add this feature into Photos. Essentially what will happen is it'll say, oh, this is an image editor app, so I'm going to make that available within Photos to use. And I'll show you this right up here. If we click on this, I can mark it up, which is Apple's thing, just like in iOS, you've probably seen the little pin, and you can go and you can circle stuff and that kind of thing. And then here's Pixelmator Pro. And notice that I've got App Store and Manage. Now Manage lets me manually add, so you notice Photoshop's not in this list. I could manually add Photoshop by clicking Manage. If I go into App Store, it'll go and it'll pull up a list of any other image editors that I might be able to use. Some of those I might have to purchase. I've already bought Pixelmator Pro, so I can just click on that and it'll open this image in Pixelmator Pro. Now here's what's interesting. I've actually got Pixelmator Pro open back here, and over here, I'm still in the Photos app. So this is sort of an interesting way of doing this. It kind of reminds me of like OpenDoc back in the day, right? Where you've sort of got apps within apps that do things. But here you can see I'm in Photos, but I'm actually using Pixelmator Pro's engine and interface, because everything else now has become just like Pixelmator Pro over here. And I can come back up and either cancel or save changes, and it'll shift me back over to the Photos interface. So it's pretty cool. We can go in here. Let me just give you an example here. Just change something like that. Let's say, well, actually, I'm going to cancel that. And then it'll say these changes will be lost. Yep, sure, no problem. And there you go. Now I'm back in the Photos app with the Photos tools. So it's two different ways to do something. One is going to create a new file, and you can then put that somewhere else. One lets you edit within the Photos app, but using Pixelmator's tool set. Is that clear? Everybody understand?
Any questions? Everybody's okay.
Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting way to do things. I personally prefer just to bring things in over here. And also, let's keep in mind, it is Apple, so you can still just drag and drop. And that's what I'm going to do right here, is drag and drop this in. And this is going to show you something that's really, really cool. And this kind of blew my mind the first time I used it. It is so fun to just play with. And that is machine language layer naming. And if you see this right here, it brought this in and automatically labeled it red sky at morning, which, I mean, that's pretty cool. Let me, I'll go over here to my cat folder, and we'll bring in a picture of a cat, and it should be able to also name that. And look at that, cat. Sometimes it gets hilariously bad results. So it might think sushi is a video game controller, or, so it's definitely basing it on, again, machine learning. So it only knows what it knows. Now, here's some architecture. Let's see what it calls this. It may just say blue sky. Oh, building. There we go. So it detected that it's mostly a building. So that's pretty cool. And I found that if you work with a lot of layers, that actually saves you a ton of time. But let's get into some of these arrangement tools, because this is the sort of bread and butter of using Pixelmator Pro. As you can see, the arrow tool, we've got all of our sort of layer manipulation tools here, right? We can rotate whatever layer we select on. And by the way, I've got it set to where I can just select by clicking on that layer item. And you notice over here, it's actually highlighting. You can do the same if you just click on the layer itself. Why that's important is because in Photoshop, the default is that you could click on a layer, but it won't select it. you have to actually go over and click on the layer itself. You can turn that off if it gets confusing, because sometimes if you've got a lot of little things, you click on the wrong guy and you've got to undo. But this is pretty nice. If I go to crop this layer, here's another interesting tool. There is an auto straighten button right here. And for those of you who take pictures and maybe they're just a little bit off kilter, you've got a horizon in the background, you notice it's a little bit off. You'll notice, of course, in iOS, the little adjustment tool, and of course, Instagram has a really good readjustment tool as well. But auto straighten will go through and it'll try to straighten out that particular photograph. In this case, my photograph really wasn't not straight. It was pretty well, maybe. It's hard to tell from that angle, isn't it? At any rate, that's one of the, like, again, the built-in tools that Pixelmator gives you. All of this is fairly straightforward. We can mirror an image, we can flip it, we can lock, hide, we can group layers, we can merge layers, all of the usual stuff that you could do with basic layers. And then we actually have layer styles. And this is where I say layer styles, this is just like Photoshop's layer styles. So if you're familiar with this, you can add a stroke. It's a little bit easier to see with the text. Stroke, and then we can change the color to that. So if you want to give your text a little bit of pop, then you can change it like that. You can change the opacity. You can do inner shadows, outer shadows. Almost as powerful as Photoshop, but those of you who've used Photoshop will notice that there's still a few things missing. There's no bevel and emboss. There's some other stuff. There's just gradient. You can't actually do a pattern like you could either with a stroke. With the fill, let's see here. You can do color and gradient, but you can't do an image. You can't do a pattern. So again, a little bit more limited than Photoshop, but how many times have you needed to use that particular feature, right? And then there's a lot of pre-built things over here. One of the really cool things that I like about Pixelmator, and I'm going to show you how this works in another context in just a minute, is if you're familiar with Photoshop, you know that you can save your preferences, and you can actually, what's cool about Adobe Cloud now is that those preferences can carry over. So if I hop on my Windows machine in the studio, I can actually pull up my preferences because I'm logged in to the same software suite, right? So if I've developed some Photoshop filters that took a long time to figure out how to get a particular effect, I can save that and I can always use it from then on out. With Pixelmator, you can do a very similar thing where if you've got a particular type of styling or color adjustment that you have, or even a special effect, which we'll look at in just a second, you can take these and you can actually drag and drop them to the desktop, and it will have the name, it'll say, you know, whatever the name of your style is, .pixelmator, and you can then use that. You can share it with friends, you can email it, all that kind of thing. So that's really handy, more handy than you might think, because what you'll find is that maybe you have a camera that has a particular color profile, right? And you know, well, this one's always pretty red, or maybe you have a room that has a certain type of lighting, but you want a white balance for a specific, for that lighting. Then you can save those preferences, and you can create a new thing right here by just clicking this plus sign and adding your own. But like I said, you can save that out and say, oh, you know, you took pictures in this room, here's the preference that'll actually help clean that up quickly. All right, so these are, like I said, different styles that you apply. Your mileage is just going to vary with these, because obviously if I apply that to a photograph, it's not going to be very effective. So these are primarily used with text. We've got our layer manipulation. Of course, here we just have our, there we go. Here we just have our usual selection tools. You can add, subtract, intersect, that kind of thing. None of this is particularly unique to Pixelmator Pro. There is the quick selection, and this is what works as the magic wand tool if you've ever used that. So I'm actually, let's go into the building thing. So here you can see it's trying to select the areas of blue within its tolerance size, and the way that you adjust tolerance in Pixelmator Pro is actually the brush size. So if I increase the brush size, it's going to sample more and it's going to add more to it. And here's what's really great. If I want to select out this sky, I just click and paint like that. like that. Get all those in. And if I want to add, I can just hit that, or I could hit the shift key down and I can come in here, add, and add. And then I can, of course, delete that out. And there you see my cat in the background. And of course, I can deselect that. I'm just going to Command D to deselect that, go back in here to my selection tool. And now you can see these things in the background. Let's hide the cat here. It's a little disturbing. And maybe put this thing back there like that. It's an odd photograph, but an odd composition. So I mentioned that they do support painting tools, and these are pretty cool. By the way, Pixelmator Pro also supports raw image. So if you want to take the raw file straight out of your camera, you can do that. It has full support for that and all the non-destructive aspects of that as well. So that's for the people who want to do that thing. I honestly don't ever mess with raw images unless a client asks me to specifically, just because it's a little bit faster to do the JPEG. At any rate, they've got some really great brushes here. It's, again, just like Photoshop. You've got a bunch of different types. And so I don't want to get into too much of that because that's not particularly unique to Pixelmator. Gradients, again, you've got a little gradient builder here. Here's another one of the little floating palettes. But you can go in here and it's, again, just like Photoshop, where you can create radial and angular. You can't create the square angles. So there's one feature missing that Photoshop has, but it's not a huge deal. Of course, eraser. You've got brushes just like you do in any eraser tool. And then we've got some repair tools. And these work just as well as you might expect. Let me actually get into the proper layer here. There we go. And so if I want to eliminate that, you can see now that I've erased one of those lines, right? And there you can see it's back. But if I just click and drag on this, and by the way, you can click, and I'm actually holding the control key down so it thinks it's a right click, but you can control click and you can change the brush size instantly. But yeah, that's as easy as it gets to be able to repair stuff. Like I can fix the crack on this thing. And there, right here, you saw, well, it's not a crack, it's a water stain. So I've cleaned up that water stain. Really, really good repair tool I found, and that fixes like 90% of the things that I need to fix. But you also have a clone tool, just like in Photoshop. But here, what I like about this is it shows you, you hold down the Option key to pick like your target. So let's say I want to clone this light. But then what's neat is as you move away, it'll show you, of course, I've got to click first. There we go, set my point. And then if I move away, it's supposed to show, well, it used to show what it would actually paint with. Oh, that's because I'm behind the tool there. I was on the wrong layer. So it's actually going to paint with more blue, but you can't see it with that. All right, hold on. There we go. Now you can see the little light. Actually, so I cloned that, and now I can move this light wherever I want to. If I want to paint a light right there, I can do that. Oh, actually, it's actually painting behind it. Hold on. Bam, there we go. All right, so that's the clone tool. Again, that works pretty much like Photoshop's does. We've got Smudge Tools, which is, again, just like Photoshop. You're going to take something and you can smoosh it around like that. One thing I can show you also is, let's see if this has got it in here, if it added it. Here we go. Nope. I was going to say, hopefully this has the ML Super resolution. So if you can see that, but ML Super resolution, this was just added. I literally updated the software about an hour before I got on here. So let's see if image ML Super resolution, and it's going to take it a second to think. Of course, it's going to depend on the size of the overall document, that kind of thing. Hopefully, if it takes too long here, we'll just cancel it out. And of course, you can cancel it just by hitting the little X right there. So it could just be that this is a really big file and it's trying to, my poor Mac. I expect for the fans to kick in a minute. All right, well, we'll cancel that out. I'll show you some other things first. There's the Darken and Lighten tools, just like you would normally find. desaturation tools, warping. Again, it's sort of like smudging. You can move things around. And then we've got some basic, they're not the most robust, and again, they're not as robust as Photoshop, but we do have some vector tools if you want to be able to create some vector line art in here. And you can see over here that this is like a path. That's good for masking and for some other things if you just need to use those. I'm not a big vector guy, which is why my Twitter handle is SuperPixels. And so then we start to get into, now we've got shapes. Again, this is just like in Photoshop. They work exactly the same way. You've got your stroke and fill tools over there. And we went over the text tools a little bit like that. They do have these nice built-in. So if you're working with something like a newsletter or you have standard title, head, subtitle, all that kind of thing, you can create your own presets again, and you can use those so that you have that standard throughout. But where things get really fun is when we start to get into the all of the color adjustments. And one of the things that was a little bit different, and I had to wrap my mind around in Pixelmator Pro versus Photoshop or even the Photos app, is the fact that you don't actually see everything all at once. So I'm going to, let me just zoom back out here like this. And you notice there is a ML Enhance button right here. That's very much like in the Photos app where it's got the little magic wand and it just makes a lot of calculations and it says, okay, here's what this should look like optimally, right? So it does a lot of optimization on the back end. There we go. I mean, look at that. That's a huge difference. And if we look at the histogram here, we can see that some of my colors are, coming out of there. And so it's not well color balanced right now. By the way, this photo was taken, I think, with an iPhone 7 about a year ago. And so if we hit ML Enhance, like I said, that's quite a difference. Is that better or worse? Well, that's sort of the quandary with this machine learning stuff, is that sometimes it does a great job. Sometimes our eyes want to see something different, right? And that's where all of these different color adjustments come in. Now, you have on each one of these, like white balance, you have an ML, which gives you that option to automatically adjust. And on some of those, it works really well. Like the white balance on here, okay, which do you want? Do you want a cooler look? Do you want a warmer look? That kind of thing. But we can obviously manually change this as well with these sliders, and you can see the histogram moving around down there. Again, lightness and color balance. These three features, which by the way, you notice that you can turn these on and off. There's a little checkbox right there. And you can reset adjustments, and you can also show original. So if I come over here and change the temperature, I can click on show original. And if I hold it down, it shows what that originally looked like. You can deactivate these with just the checkbox. But white balance, lightness, and color balance are the three things that the Pixelmator team felt were the most used features. And so that's why all of these are here. And it does make sense. You want to change your lighting. You want to adjust the color just a little bit like this, and you can adjust these things. These are shadows, midtones, and highlights, just so you know. So this is more like the upper end of the histogram, and these will be the mids, and these will be the darker regions. And you can manipulate these and you can kind of see what they do over here. But what's interesting about Pixelmator is that it does hide a lot of stuff at first. So I actually have to click on add, and that's where you see the rest of the stuff that you have access to. And I'm not going to go through all of these. Most of it's very similar to what you would see in other apps like Sepia. There's a fade, which really just darkens everything. There's vignette, which adds shadowing to the corners and edges in sort of a circular pattern. And then we have cool stuff like replace color, where you can select, say someone's wearing a blue shirt, you want to change it to red. You can select that color and then replace it with something else. But the biggest one, of course, is going to be levels. This is what a lot of Photoshop folks are used to, is being able to come in here and move these sliders around to change. Now, color balance does a very similar thing with shadows, midtones, and highlights, but here we have just a little bit more finesse on the in-between sides, and you can see how it eases those color changes there. Now, all of this is like really advanced, and it's the kind of thing that people can get deep in the weeds with, and you can start messing around, and the next thing you know, the picture looks completely crazy. I can, of course, reset all of these adjustments and go back to the original. And Pixelmator has added a whole bunch of really great presets over here, which again, you can add your own. But if we change it to cold, if we go to rosy, it turns it warm. And what's cool is that it actually shows you all of the changes that it made over here. So you can kind of learn from it by just choosing some of these presets and trying those out. And then finally, we've got some special effects. And these are a ton of fun. There's a lot of things that you can play around with in here. But again, notice that under our effects palette, we've got all this empty space here, and it's only got 2 tools. Well, there's no way you're getting stuff like a bokeh effect or a twist from just, you know, these 2 things. So that's again where we go to add, and there are a ton of things. I mean, there's the halftone generator. You can create stars and sunbeams and clouds. You can create, you can add fills. There's a perspective transform mask to alpha, where it takes something that you've changed and then you can turn it into a mask, which again, we're not going to get into that advanced stuff. But I want to show you that, you know, it has some things that are actually built in that you don't find built into Photoshop. So this is one area, I think, where there's a little bit of an advantage, especially if you're not wanting to, you know, be Burt Monroy and, you know, have 8,000 layers in Photoshop and you've got 32 gigs of RAM on your $50,000 Mac Pro. So, but these are cool. They do a lot of great things. And just like before, we've got all these great presets over here that can give you some really cool effects just kind of out of the box here. And you notice that it will change our effects to add the things that it used for that preset. So if you're wondering, how do I get this over here? It's actually going to show you right there. It shows its own work. And then you can come in here and you can manipulate as you want to. And notice how smooth. I mean, that's a lot of math going on right there, but that is like absolutely responsive, buttery smooth feedback on this. You can change the angle. It's just a really, really smooth, powerful experience. Let me reset that and show you like bokeh. And so you can see in the bokeh section here, you have a ton of presets, but you can, of course, create your own. And this is, it's sort of metaphor is it's got the little spring handle. This is just like Pixelmator for those of you who've used it. You've probably seen these control handles and how they have this cool line that takes you back to where the effect is actually coming from. And for visual people like myself, that's super handy. So you can get exactly the effect that you want, and then you can manipulate each aspect of this. And we can change the hue. You know, if you're looking to make a Christmas card, this is like a really easy way to do something like that. Anyway, that's like the big overview of this. Like I said, there's a lot more to it. There are things like match colors. So if you've ever had the experience of maybe copying, this is a fun office trick, right? It's where you cut someone's head out and you put it on someone else's body. And then you notice that those colors don't quite match. There's actually an ML match colors feature. So if you paste something in, it will try to match the color profile of what you're pasting it into. So that's some of the real power that's just built into this. And I find that it's a lot more approachable than Photoshop overall, and it's a lot faster. Any questions on any of that? I know it's a lot.
Yes,
Is there
sir.
an upgrade if you already own Pixelmator, or do you just buy Pixelmator Pro straight up?
There is a, they've got a thing on their website that says that you can upgrade. I'm not sure what the upgrade pricing is. I think it's maybe half off, but I got it. I bought Pixelmator Pro when it first came out, and it was like already discounted, you know, like they do for the first week. So I'm not sure, but yeah, there is upgrade pricing.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is there a way to go from a photograph to a line drawing?
You mean like vector art, or do you mean like make it just stylized?
Now you're beyond my pay grade, but go to a line, say you have a grandchild and you want to do something to crayon or something like that. Would that be vector?
Yeah, if you want to manipulate it. So what I'll show you is actually you can do something over here, and I just kind of like blew by it. But under halftone, you do have things like the Cmyk halftone that makes it look kind of like a comic book. Or there's another one that I want to say does make it look like a line drawing. There is that, you can do that with sort of the emboss, and you can manipulate, what is it, find edges. In that, here we go, comics. Oops, there we go. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, so that feature's never been fantastic in any result, but it's also nice because you can. Let's see, we can preserve transparency here. Yeah, it's doing that, and yeah, I mean, we could layer then another copy of the cat on top of that and fade it out to maybe make it a little bit more reasonable, but that's kind of as close as you're going to get to what you're talking about.
What do you use today to do that?
Adobe.
Adobe?
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're so, I mean, find edges has been around for like a really, really long time, almost as long as emboss. And they've just been better at that in general. I mean, they used to have well, in Illustrator, you can find the edges and it'll try to convert it into, it doesn't do a great job, but tries to convert it over. I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't gotten better in the intervening years, but yeah, Photoshop does a better job of doing that for sure.
One of the reasons that I wanted Victor to talk to us is to have you try to understand that these apps work together with the photo app, which is a big advantage, I think, being an Apple user, is that you can go into the photo app and get to Pixelmator or many other photo programs, which is very advantageous. Does anybody do much of that here? Nope.
If you buy the app for the Mac, do you automatically get it on the iPad?
No, they're two separate apps. But you can share files between the two through iCloud, which is kind of nice.
Well, now go ahead.
How many licenses do you get? So if you want to put it on your iMac and your laptop and stuff like that?
I got this through the Mac App Store, so anywhere where you're logged in as you and your iCloud account, you should be able to use it.
Okay.
Is that the case with, do you use Final Cut Pro at all?
Oh yeah.
And because it's an app now, you can use it on any device, as many devices as you want?
Yeah, as long as you're logged into your iCloud account, which of course they've made it very painful to not be logged into your iCloud account on a Mac. So yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Well, Victor, a lot of I just sort of wanted to try to get you guys exposed to the potential of what you can do with the photo program on a Mac and how it can lead you into these other programs. And they're just, there's a world out there that's unbelievable as far as photo editing and so forth. And we really appreciate your time, Victor. Have you got a trick? Got a trick?
I'll show you this thing that's more just a kind of a little sleight of hand thing that I used to do. I don't know if it'll show up. Can you see me on the, let me stop sharing here real quick and just, can you see my screen or me?
Yeah.
I should say? Okay. So what I would do is take, here you can see these Kitten Stuff Done cards, and I've got one in the middle that's turned over, and I could do that and very quickly flip the card over, and it basically reversed this middle card. That's hard to see, but but I will take this chance to show you. These are some of the cards that I created with Pixelmator Pro, and you can see I added text, and I had to do some color correction on drawings that people gave me. We did the back here in a sort of kaleidoscope filter, and so these are printed on cardstock and professionally printed cards. So it does do print quality work if that's the kind of thing you're into.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Anybody else have any questions? Victor, thank you very much.
absolutely. Thanks, Doug.